the session today are to explore the options available for short-term work in the UK, to consider how it is possible to interpret immigration route criteria given client requirements, to weigh the risks when choosing routes, to consider the practical and compliance concerns when advising, and also at the end to think about where the rules might be headed or how they could be improved to cater for short-term work mobility. Just note that the session is meant to mirror the types of discussion practitioners are having when dealing with short-term work situations that don't fit with the immigration rules. While this has long been an issue, post-Brexit changes have brought them into focus. The webinars come about because of experienced practitioners feeling there is a significant gap in the current immigration offer when advising clients with short-term work needs. It can sometimes feel quite isolated when you're dealing with these issues on your own, so today's webinar is a chance to share the challenges practitioners face when advising in the area. And also there's no neat answers, so hopefully today's session will equip you better to weigh up the options and risks when advising on short-term work. In terms of the format, we'll have 3 short case studies to highlight the main options: skilled worker, business visitor and frontier worker permit, as well as touching upon the other relevant routes. Case studies are in the chat function. They're reproduced there, the 3 of them. You'll notice we're not exhaustively covering all the options during the case studies, but rather highlighting the closest fit, at least in the opinion of the speakers. And at the end of the case studies, as I mentioned, there'll be 10 minutes for questions. So I'll now introduce the 3 fantastic speakers we have. First of all, Natasha Geyer-Williams, who is a partner at Geyer-Williams Immigration. She specialises in work-related immigration routes and has substantial experience advising businesses and workers, business or sponsored workers and right to work. She regularly engages with the Home Office, contributes to consultations on policy and legislation. She's hosted joint trainings with UKVI and is a member of the Law Society's Immigration Committee and a former ILPA trustee. Then we have Joanna Hunt. She's a Director and Head of Immigration at Phil Fisher. She's an immigration lawyer with over 14 years experience advising businesses and individuals on all aspects of the UK immigration system. She specialises on all business immigration and global mobility matters, including professional services and technology. Her practice includes advice on work-based visas, sponsor licenses, illegal working and global mobility support. She has particularly strong expertise with complex applications for registering children as British from her voluntary work with the charity The Project for the Registration of Children as British Citizens. She's also a member of the Law Society's Immigration Committee and is often involved in stakeholder engagement with the Home Office. And finally, Megan Vizilla is a senior associate in the immigration team at Pennington's Manches and is experienced in all aspects of immigration and nationality law. She provides advice to SMEs, large multinationals, high net worth individuals, celebrities, tech firms and entrepreneurs. She's also got a particular knowledge of complex European and UK nationality. She's an active member of ILPA and regularly provides training for HR and recruitment teams and other practitioners. So without further ado, they are our speakers. And the first case study is case study 1, which I'm going to read out, and then Megan will talk a lot about. So case study 1. A UK business wants to bring in workers from a newly acquired entity overseas, which was acquired 3 months ago for training. However, as part of the training, 8 key overseas senior staff will be meeting with the UK business's clients and working on UK lead projects. The intention is for the orientation to last 6 weeks and to facilitate the integration of the overseas staff into the UK business's management and financial streams. There is no intention for the overseas staff to visit the UK on a regular basis. This is just a one-off as part of integration measures to smooth acquisition. So Megan, what do we think about this?
Well, thanks, Jonathan. And just to explain to the attendees, this is kind of typically the way we see new inquiries come in. We've got a set of information from our clients that they believe they've given, sufficient information for us to advise on, but we always have further questions. There's kind of, at this point, I'm seeing maybe about 3 potential options here, depending on the level of integration, a level of training level of what they call work that these 8 key overseas senior staff are going to have to undertake in the UK. But I think what's normally important at the outset of this is to just ask further questions of yourself and of the client to just gauge what options there might be available. Just so you have the ability to change tack depending on what your client says is the most important part of this transfer, this visit, to the client, to the business, to the contracts it has. So kind of looking at it, you know, newly acquired entity overseas, interesting. Preliminary thoughts are this is probably going to largely fall within the business visitor route. But if we are looking at other routes like the skilled worker, the global business mobility, senior specialist staff, that 3 months, particularly for the global business mobility route, might be a bit of a spanner in the works, depending, particularly for the 8 key overseas senior staff, if they're going to be needed here longer, if what they're doing, the work, is constituted work and it is important to the business. We have to look at how long they've been with the overseas entity and whether they would meet the high earner thresholds, because 3 months working in this now acquired group isn't sufficient to meet the general salary thresholds to qualify for sponsorship under the specialist skilled worker route, for instance. And yeah, generally, I'd like to know a lot more about what this work is that the 8 senior staff need to be doing and whether it can fit into the business visitor permitted activities. So yeah, the 3 options I'm kind of touching on, mainly business visitor route, if we can use that option, possibly global business mobility for the senior specialist worker for the 8 key staff, or failing that, skilled worker, again, dependent on a multitude of things, including whether the client has a sponsor license. So kind of general questions that you'd want to flesh out. How many workers are going to be coming for training? What are their nationalities? That's going to determine kind of the level of risk for the non-visa nationals coming over, or possible expenditure if you have, you know, several visa applications that you might need to submit. I'll get to the kind of costing a bit later. But what you see and what we were talking about when preparing for this was particularly the difficulties around the visitor route, because if you have several people coming in at different times, you might get several different responses from the immigration officers they meet if they're, you know, non-visa nationals making the applications at port. So that's kind of one of the first things to kind of gauge how large this project is, this training project. What the training is going to consist of, you're going to want to know about that, because we're going to need to apply it to the permissible activities and see if it fits within the business visitor rules or if it falls outside. Particularly that work that the 8 key senior staff are taking. I've had experience of this recently where a client came to me saying that they had senior staff coming to work, and it transpired that actually what they were going to be doing fit within permitted activities. So the client's definition of work and the immigration rule definition of work can be different. And then I've touched on this a little bit. Does the entity in the UK have a license already? If so, what kind of license? Have they taken any steps to link this newly acquired company to their license? Again, this is going to impact timing and options potentially, and I'll get to those in a minute. And then how soon is one of the big questions too. How soon do the staff need to be in the UK? Because that's going to again impact a lot of the consideration. If, you know, if we're looking down the barrel of applying for a sponsor license, this could be 3 months out and they might need the workers in 2 weeks' time, or the visitors in that case in 2 weeks' time. So these are kind of the preliminary questions to ask, just so that you have a better handle of what's important, what are the trigger points for the client, what's something that they might be able to modify to fit within certain categories, because that's a lot of what we do as practitioners working within the options we have at the moment. The visitor option, I think, is going to be the best in this case, so long as we can make each individual fit within the permitted activities. So let's take a look at what those are. Kind of the knee-jerk, I think, where I went to first was looking at permitted activity 5. That's for intra-corporate training. But you have to be careful, and particularly if you're providing letters of support for someone who's applying at the border, a non-visa national, or providing letters and representations in a visa application, you need to get this right. the intra-corporate activities and the training and knowledge sharing covered there is actually inward bound to the UK. So it's the employee from overseas coming to impart training in the UK, not the other way around. So your better bet here would be to go under PA 10.2, which provides for overseas employees to be trained in the UK, and that's what it looks like is happening here. In terms of those 8 overseas senior staff, I'd want to know what they're doing, and in terms of the work. Meeting in the UK, that can be covered. You know, meeting clients can potentially be covered under general permitted activities. So for instance, they could be briefed on requirements that the UK clients have here, so long as the work they're doing is taken overseas. So, you know, what I've also seen in practice is clients coming with a piece of work for a project that these in this case 8 key overseas staff would be undertaking. And we've said, all right, well, A, B, and C will fit under permitted activities, but D, E, and F, we're going to have to find alternative solutions because these people were needed quickly and they didn't have time to sponsor them. So those are things, you know, sometimes it's a bit of a negotiation with a client on the individuals can do these bits, but not these others. So those are kind of some of the considerations to take into account, and maybe business visitor would work in this case. The consideration on costs, however, does come into play when you're looking at this, because if you have, and also timing, if you have non-visa nationals, US nationals, Americans, Canadians, etc., Europeans, you know, this is great, come over. There's no fee associated. You can just jump on a plane, you present the papers at the border. Drawback, you know, you might get differentiated decisions from different immigration officers at different airports, and I've seen that happen too. We've had 9 people get in and 2 not, or you know, 9 entered in one category and 1 landed a different way. So you have that inconsistency in decisions when you apply at port. Conversely, if you've got visa nationals, it's £100 for the visa application, and then depending on the jurisdiction, a couple of days to several weeks to get that visa processed, and potential additional fees to expedite the processing to get that few days processing time. So this can be a problem for clients who need people here quickly, or, you know, well, it's 8 key personnel and then there's some other that are coming to train. If it's 5, maybe that's okay. If it's 35, the fees. So these, in terms of sponsorship, I'm going to go a little bit more quickly because we are going to cover sponsorship in more detail later on. But, you know, again, key considerations. Do they have a license? Does the client in the UK have a license or not? That's going to, you know, impact the timing of when they can bring people over, and also the cost to them, which I'll just run through very quickly. Is English language going to be an issue for the workers or for the individuals coming from overseas? If it is, you know, then instead of the skilled worker sponsorship, we'd need to start looking at global business mobility. And that's where timing could again be impacted if the entities aren't linked, if there's no record at the Home Office that there's common in ownership and control between the UK business and the entity that they've just acquired. And you're also going to then again need to look at salary thresholds, because typically for the global business mobility route, the employee has to have been working for the overseas entity for at least 12 months. It's only been acquired 3 months ago, or they have to be earning at least the equivalent of £73,900. So that might work for the key senior staff, but it may not. So these are things to consider, you know, when looking at the licenses, you know, the timing and various factors as to whether the individuals themselves are going to fit within suitability for sponsorship as well as their roles. Costs is going to come in to play here. If they don't have a license already, in addition to the time, roughly, you know, potentially 2 months or so to get a license, it's going to cost at least £536, maybe £1,476, depending on the size of the UK entity. It's going to cost £199 per person to sponsor them. If they're coming for less than 6 months, these guys coming for 6 weeks, no immigration skills charge, no immigration health surcharge, but visas still are going to cost £625 each. So you're looking at significant fees, particularly if you're, you know, over 8 people in this case. You're talking about up to £10,000 cost to the client, and was that factored in when they pitched for this tender for this contract? And again, you have to look at the salary thresholds and the skills thresholds to make sure that they're suitable for sponsorship in the first place. So these are kind of the initial considerations for this particular option. And I think, in the interest of time and to get into the media questions on sponsorship, I think I'll hand it now back to you, Jonathan.
Well, did you have any other follow up on that, Joe? I think you're on mute.
Takes a couple of presses to come off. Yeah, sorry. No, I mean that was really thorough, really helpful, Megan. I think it's just, I suppose it's an assessment in terms of the risks of and the benefits of each route, and in terms of, I mean, in terms of the kind of if they were to opt to come as visitors, do you think the comfort letters, carrying things like that, carrying the evidence of having been eligible for visiting, is that a necessity at all times when you're advising clients, or do you just see it as a case by case? In terms of business, if they've got mass mobility in terms of visitors coming in and out at all points, because that's often a question I get, is does everybody have to carry a letter telling them what they're doing?
It's that favorite lawyer answer, it depends. But yeah, you're right. I mean, I generally err on the side of providing it, because particularly, even the most unflappable businessmen can sometimes trip up at the border, particularly if they're being grilled. And so I do find it helpful, if I've got clear instruction from the client as to what these individuals are going to be doing, to provide a letter to say just that, to direct the case, the immigration officer in this case, to 10.2 and, appendix permitted activities or something like that. And also to give structure sometimes to the individual, to make sure that they understand completely the parameters they're working within when coming to the UK as a business visitor. I also realized using the term working there was an unintended pun.
Can I ask a question? It used to be possible to call immigration officers at various airports in advance and say, look, this chap's coming over, we're not quite sure, is that still a runner, or is it case by case? And
I mean, I don't know, Megan, I've had, sometimes you get a gem of a person who's amazingly helpful, and the best interactions I've ever had with the immigration system have been via the border control. But I'm lucky, it's down to the person you get.
Complete agreement. I mirror that exactly. And it's that funny thing too, where I have preferential airports. I kind of breathe a sigh of relief when I hear somebody's coming through X airport instead of Y airport. So it's that too. So yes, definitely. What they do now is we used to fax them a whole series of representations and documents. They don't do that anymore. It's more of a, let's discuss it, and then you get the standard. We can't assess a case. We can't give you a definitive answer until the person presents themselves. But if this and this occur, then we'll probably do this.
That's helpful. Thank you. Excellent. Well, if we move on now to the second, thanks very much, May. We'll move on to the second case study, which is case study 2, which Natasha is going to talk about. An international energy company group headquartered in the US has purchased newly developed hydraulic fracking equipment from a Canadian engineering company. It wishes to trial the equipment in the UK. The energy company group has a UK subsidiary, but the subsidiary is not involved in any of the fracking equipment trials. Its operations are offshore. US headquarters, which purchased the equipment and is the direct contractual party with the Canadian engineering company, wants the Canadian company's engineers, who helped to develop the equipment, to carry out the trials in the UK. Okay, Natasha.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to give an FYI that I have a tendency to cut into coughing. So if I do, Megan, you've promised to take over. I have to apologize. So this is our opportunity really to look at the visitor route as well, in particular on a paragraph that has been, I'd say, increasingly used, or at least put forth by the Home Office as a solution to a lot of the short-term mobility opportunities that our clients want to use. And I'm at the beginning of this, as we do, and I think Megan said this as well, you look at these kind of cryptic facts that the client gives you, and you think, okay, what's my starting point? In this case, I look at the word engineer and I rejoice, because I know that at the end of the day, there's probably an expensive option that might require sponsorship, but that engineers are normally able to fit under sponsored categories. I'll touch upon that a little bit later. But I'm also, as I was trained, think of the easiest first, Natasha, and I'm thinking Canadian. So my second thought moves to, well, do they have any UK ancestry that we might be able to capitalize on? Or dare we even mention it, British citizenship? I mean, those are long shots, but it's worth just, in the kind of analysis that we're going through, to touch upon that in the initial analysis. So we're thinking very much that this is a periodic work opportunity in the UK. There's no sort of word or mention, although we'd have to ask about it, as to exactly how long these Canadian engineers are intended to be here. We're assuming that it's going to be periodic visits, maybe once or twice in a year, for a few weeks perhaps, and then they go back and they get their analysis, but they can do that elsewhere. And so that draws my attention to the business visitor route, which is, and one would hope eventually when the Home Office, sorry, this is going to be a little bit political, but when the Home Office eventually realizes, I hope soon, that we do need a real solution here, perhaps the visitor route, and in particular PA7, can be expanded to provide more assistance to clients in this situation. But as it stands at the moment, it's probably worth revisiting what is PA7. So I hope you don't mind. I'd like to go through it kind of strand by strand, because that's how I'm kind of trying it on against the facts when I'm going into a client advice piece. And I'm thinking, okay, so we've got an PA7 itself starts off with an employee of an overseas company. Well, we can tick that box. We've got an engineering company with employees overseas, and that they are coming to install, dismantle, repair, service, advise on machinery, equipment, or in the IT industry, computer software or hardware. And I think our case study probably ticks all those boxes. And I don't know that enough about engineering, but I'm sure that the words dismantle, install, advise on would probably be quite easy to fit into that inevitable comfort letter that we've just been talking about. And so we then move on to where there is a contract of purchase or supply or lease. Well, we have a contract of purchase. The international company group has purchased this equipment. Now, there is a significant snag, which I'm just going to hop over for a second, but I promise I will come back to it. And that there are two further conditions to meet, which are as follows. The overseas company is a manufacturer or supplier. Well, I think, we've got very basic facts, but again, we are going to probably, for the purposes of today, assume that there is a contract of purchase. But I think what we'll have to do is look very carefully into that contract. But again, we'll loop back to that. So the overseas company is the manufacturer or supplier, and has this contract of purchase. And we are then at the point of, we don't have to look at the second part. So that, is it part of a contractual arrangement or for after sales services agreed at the time of sale or lease? Because hopefully we've met the first part of that condition regarding the overseas company. Now, where PA7 starts to, become a real issue, and I think in particular, a lot of my experience has fallen around the fact that the contract of purchase, for example, it has to be with a UK company. And in this instance, we can see that we've got an international company group, the parent company in the US. They are the contractors. They are the ones that are purchasing the equipment, and they're bringing it into the UK to try out for fracking. The UK does have, the international company does have a UK subsidiary, but that subsidiary is not involved And so therefore you start to raise questions in your mind. Well, how much do you, how much mileage do you have in being able to, shall we say, look at that contract and try to fit it in, or at least present it as being with the UK company as being party to that contract. And I think this is where, we start to find the difficulty, on the face of it, it looks all great, but then we just come to that one snag, which is quite a substantial one, that it has to be a contract of purchase or supply with a UK company. And in this instance, we, don't have that initially, or at least it's not visible. And I think as practitioners, that puts us, it's almost like you've just got to the end point and then you're suddenly back at the beginning. And this is where, when we're talking with clients, obviously, it's our job to make it look easy, but I think it is worthwhile sometimes giving them a sense of just how difficult it is to map these in what should be quite straightforward criteria under PA7. But actually, the exercise is quite detailed and requires you, in this instance, to pick apart the contract and see whether that can be fit into the UK entity somehow, and whether it should be. And there'll be all sorts of other, sort of very commercial reasons why that may, or even financial reasons why that shouldn't happen. But from an immigration perspective, and that's how we always say things to our clients, that, this isn't the real world, this is immigration, and I apologize for that. But it's a matter of looking at it and trying to get to that point. So the sort of sticky part here is going to be the contract has to be with a UK company. So immediately I'm thinking of backup options and thinking, well, if we can't get through this contractual issue, then we're really looking at sponsored workers. And then, there's an international contract here, Canada, it kind of almost lends into that international service supplier route for under the GBM. I know we all have our various thoughts on the how the utility of this set of some repackaged routes and some introductions under the GBM. But in this instance, you could explore the international services supply route. But I think you're going to be finding that you're back to almost same type of exercise, but with the added pressure that if you do go down this route, you're looking at sponsorship. And what does that mean? That means more costs, such as what Megan has just outlined, a lot more resource intensive, because there's got to be the ability to take out a license and the timeframes involved in that, and ultimately responsibility. Now, as to who's going to take responsibility for these workers. And so if you're looking again at that sort of sponsorship model, if you look under the GBM, you can see that there is a UK-Canada trade continuity agreement, and that engineers are eligible employees, so that's fantastic. And that, there must be service provision to the UK. Now, what it actually says is that there must be a service provision to a UK company. So do you see, it's almost like we're back to PA7, that there has to be a UK company in the picture. So in this instance, I'm thinking, would I even go down the international service suppliers route? I probably wouldn't, because if I'm going to be posed with the same problems as I would be under the business visitor category of looking at having a UK company involved, then I'm just going to go to the skilled worker route. And in view of the fact that these are Canadians, so I'm not going to have to worry about English language, and just have the UK subsidiary take out a license. Now that isn't an ideal situation, but I think that's where we're at, which is that, if the business visitor route with these very complicated factors that we need to weigh and map against the actual live situation, if you fall down on even one part of it, can you use it? And this is where I think it gets into very interesting reality of the last sort of, I don't know, 18 months. Megan and Joe, I'd be interested to know how far back the Home Office has been kind of using this. But, PA7 has been put forward on a lot of occasions when, we query the Home Office or ask to find out, well, in this situation, it's very short term. We need these people in. Do we really have to do sponsorship? Is PA7 really the can we use it? And the Home Office kind of, will come back and I think very much what Megan has said that, on any given day you'll get a different answer. Not for, intentional disparity of views, but just because, the Home Office has a number of officers and they make decisions. And some of them, will consider this situation, oh yeah, that's fine. There's an international, sort of contract, but hey, it's got a UK entity, on the ground in the UK, so that's good enough for me. Off we go. Whereas, should they? I guess is the real question. And then, I think Jonathan probably. Are you should we bring in maybe Megan to have some thoughts?
Yeah, I don't know, but Megan, did you have any thoughts on?
Yeah,
on
I
this?
mean, yeah, I agree with you. And I think that the other problem, in addition to PA7 being, I guess, a bit subjective, given the differentiated ways in which we the different answers we get from different people in policy, it's not actually very broad when you think of all the different things that people might need to come to do. It's covering software, yes, computer, it's covering certain equipments and hardware, but I've looked at it recently for stonemasons and people fitting marble, which is highly artisan skilled work, and have not been able to square them within PA7. So it's that kind of, it's the difficulty that is also not expansive enough if this is going to be the panacea for the problems that Brexit has brought.
It's being held out as a panacea, and that's the part where I find, I'm not saying I don't want to sound, ungrateful. And if I have it in Home Office writing that says I can use this and that this is going to be for my client's purpose to bring them over, of course I'm going to put that right on top of the comfort letter and let it to the Home Officers to kind of duke it out. But it's that kind of uncomfortable point, as practitioners. Am I able to say to my client to rely on this when, instead of natural review of it and understanding, I wouldn't. And also there's just so many parts of it. I find it, and I'm not saying this to whine, but I'm just saying as practitioners, the law has to be able to be used. And if you've got such an intricate set of facts to fit, it makes you wonder.
Well,
I suppose also if you have like you're spending ages looking at the contract and looking at the minutiae of the rules, and you've got an immigration officer, he's not going to know about all this, or an E-gate, or Mr. E-gate.
Well, especially if you put forward, even, I mean, I go for full disclosure and I wouldn't want to, mislead anybody here. But if I happen to drop into the second paragraph in bold, the UK entity of, the company group, well, I don't know. It poses us, very strong challenges.
Yeah.
So.
Okay. Very interesting. And before I go on to thank you very much, Tess. Before I go on to the third and final case study, I was just going to say, I don't think we have any questions yet. So people, please, if you have any questions, put them into the Slido. You have to go into that link in the chat and just put them in there. Okay. Great. Well, thank you. Let's go on to our final case study, which is going to be Joe leading it. And I'll read out the case study here. A Polish tech startup has been working with a venture studio in the UK. The aim has been to set up an entity in the UK to launch their app in the UK market. The CEO of the company, who's also a Polish national, has been traveling to the UK to work with the venture studio since early 2020. However, when COVID hit, the work went online until face-to-face work recommenced in late 2021. The UK subsidiary of the company is now ready to launch, and the CEO will need to work out of the UK for the majority of their time over the next couple of years. They need advice on their visa options. Jo.
Brilliant. Thanks, Jonathan. Well, I chose this case study, which is based on a real life example, because I thought it illustrates quite nicely one of the problems that Brexit has caused in the end of free movement for more senior executives based in Europe and for European nationals, how previously they came in and out of the UK free of any restrictions, without any anxiety about what they're doing. But now, obviously, they need to plan ahead in terms of what they're in terms of the activities they're going to do. If they're looking to work in the country, in the UK, they need to consider all the visa options. So when we're looking at this case study, I've parked business visitor. The client in their instructions has been very clear that they need to be able to work in the UK. So if I'm prepping for my first call with them, some of the things that I want to get out of the call based on the brief email I've received on this, I think I'd want to know a little bit more about the long-term goals for the individual, for the senior executive. They talk about the fact that they want to be based in the UK over the next few years. What does that mean? Does that mean how long in terms of how many days a week, how many days a month? Do they want the possibility of settlement in the long term? That's always a key question to ask when you've got people potentially coming on a short-term basis. What is the future looking like for them? And can we get them onto a visa route which preserves that future, or at least works towards that future? And hopefully for everybody on the call, bells are ringing of what of the big option, what we're going to talk about for this case study of the Frontier Worker Permit. But this key date, they've started working, they're an EU national who started working pre-2020. When we talk about work or what they've been doing in the UK, we really need to drill down a bit more about what those activities involved, as that is going to be very important when we analyse the Frontier Worker Permit, which I'll go on to do. And then I'd like to know a little bit more about the entity in the UK, because if we have to look at sponsorship options, we'll need to know at what stage this company is in terms of its startup journey. Is it trading? Is it not? And then that will inform potential choices within the sponsorship sphere. So those are some of the issues that I want to get out of, say, the first call. But already, as I've said, I immediately start thinking about the Frontier Worker Permit. And even though during the course of this course, there is a lot of the news within the short-term mobility area isn't that great, or the options available aren't often the best. The Frontier Worker Permit is actually a great visa option if it is applicable to you, and is a great option for those people who need to come into the UK on a short-term basis for work. But there are problems with it, or in significant hurdles with it, which means that it won't be a long-term sustainable option for lots of people. But the fact that we have, so just by way of background for anybody unfamiliar with the Frontier Worker Permit, this was born out of the withdrawal agreement. It was a necessity, a key part of the Brexit negotiation process, because there were identified these individuals, these EU nationals who have been working in the UK but who may live outside of the UK. So they needed a visa to protect them once free movement came to an end. So up came the Frontier Worker Permit scheme. And this is only aimed at EU nationals, those EU nationals who pre 31st of December 2020, 11 p.m, that key date, were not primarily resident in the UK, but are a worker for or self-employed person who has retained that status. So it links back to this particular point in time. So if you have an EU national who has potentially started work in the UK before that key point, we can look at the Frontier Worker Permit. If we start to kind of drill down on what that involves, one of the key points is showing for the frontier worker is showing that somebody is not primarily resident in the UK. And I think for this individual in this case study, that's not going to be a problem. That's by, you can either show that the definition of not primarily resident is so extensively broad that pretty much anybody can come into it, because you're not primarily resident if you've been outside of the UK for more than 180 days in any 12-month period, but you're also primarily resident, which is quite odd, if you've only left the UK twice in the last 12 months. So it's unlikely that that will be an issue here. And in terms of the application process, we'd need to get together travel tickets to show this person's travel in and out. The major problem, though, is going to be about the work element and when they started work in the UK. We know that they started work in pre 31st of December 2020, but we're being told we've had this big chunk of time outside of the UK during COVID, which often happened. And this is when I've been dealing with frontier worker permit cases. This has often been the case. They started work pre 2020, end of 2020, but then there's been a massive chunk of time where they didn't travel. And how would the Home Office view that? In terms of work, as I mentioned, the work in whether somebody is or is not working is a real gnarly concept. And it's often one, particularly with business visitors, we have to explain what is and what is not work. And the business visitors make that easy. You've got your set of permitted activities and you try and shoehorn into that, as we've tried to do with PA7. With frontier worker, we have this definition, that's been transmitted from EU law, that you have to work has to be either genuine, it has to be genuine, effective, and not marginal and ancillary. So as business immigration lawyers, we're left with this uncomfortable feeling of having to interpret what activities somebody's doing. And the important thing to bear in mind is, are they coming in to do visitor related activities, such as attending meetings or interviews or things like that? If they have been doing that, and that's what they were doing pre the end of 2020, that may not be deemed as work or may not be considered as work, and therefore the frontier worker permit is not an option. So for this guy, I'm saying he's a guy, actually could be a girl. I didn't actually designate a gender. She, or we're being told that he's just came in, and we need to know a bit more about what he was doing. And with the case that I had, which this came from, we really had to look into the activities that this person was doing and provide evidence to show that that this wasn't just coming in for meetings, that it was work related, that this was substantive operational decisions were taking place. And I think in this case, because we're being told they're setting up an entity, this isn't doing actions that to facilitate work that's based outside of the UK. This is to taking the decisions which is going to build and create an entity within the UK. So I think we've got a strong argument there. The other issue that we're going to have to face is in respect of the time spent abroad during COVID. In my experience so far with the frontier worker permit scheme, the Home Office have been quite generous when faced with instances of this. Certainly in the applications that I've had, majority of which have had a long period of time spent abroad. The Home Office wants to see somebody to have come in every 12-month period for work purposes, or to have retained their frontier worker status during that time. They will accept somebody has retained their frontier worker status if they've been affected by COVID, and that was due to, say, an office closure, or people told to work from home during that period of time. So in this case, the decision was taken for the work to go online, potentially office closure reasons. We'd want to get evidence of that from the venture studio and for the company that he works with, and put that in as part of the application. So I think in sum, it's a pretty strong case for a frontier worker. If he gets a 5-year permit, if successful, the application is free, it's online, upload evidence, pretty quick decision turnaround time still now. I'm seeing decisions, I did one recently within a few days, and as I say, quite generous Home Office caseworking at the present time. But the individual needs to be aware that it's a 5-year permit which will not lead to settlement. They have to retain their status as a frontier worker during that 5 years. So they must remain primarily resident outside of the UK. So if this person's plans change and they want to spend more time in the UK and want to settle, we have to look at sponsorship options. I will briefly mention these because I know we're running out of time, but this could be an occasion that the global business mobility expansion worker route could come into play, one of those brand spanking new GBM routes. That is for companies who haven't yet started trading and want to send in a team or team members into the UK. Most of the thinking around this route is that it isn't the best in terms of the offer that it gives people. It's only a 2-year visa. It's a license that the overseas company acquires initially, but that license is only valid for 4 years. So I would be saying to this individual, if they're happy to go with a frontier worker permit, they get that, allows them to come in, take the actions they need to get that entity set up fully. Once the entity is set up, get either a skilled worker license or the GBM, senior specialist worker, to grow headcount or transfer other staff members into the UK. I'll leave it there.
Okay. I mean, just one thing on it, it's interesting. It's been such a long time since the end of the transition period, but they're still going through. Yeah, they're still.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Sorry, Natasha, you go.
I was just going to pip in and say, yes, they are. And quite incredibly, I think that very generous casework that we're seeing right now that allows I mean, I don't know, Joe, do you get situations where you think, how did you get this? You know,
Oh no,
when
well, the ones I've handled, there was a couple where I very carefully prepped the client on the risk of refusal, because I was saying I really don't, this is 50-50, but the instance that I had, there was no better option, so they were willing to take that risk, and when it was approved, I was startled. I did actually, I mean, Jonathan made it via ILPA, we did a bit of surveying of ILPA members on the Frontier Worker Permit scheme, and to see what what their experiences of caseworking, that it was a real high success rate. Only a couple of occasions where I heard of refusals, and they thought that they were anomalies. But yeah, the Home Office stats and the reports that we hear from ILPA members are that the success rate is still high. But we do, you know, we have to prep of risk of refusal. And in this instance, you know, that I would be saying, Frontier Worker will help you, but you know, if a more secure option may be one of the sponsorship.
Thank you. Well, just in terms of time, I was just going to sort of flag up a few routes or a few possible solutions that have been flagged up by members of the panel. You've probably seen that, you know, there's apparently a review going on in terms of immigration routes in the context of the plan for growth. And there's also been other stirrings in the press about the realization, I think, of the problems of short-term work. So we may actually see some movement in this space. And some of the ideas included expanding the paid permitted engagement criteria, mirroring the Frontier Worker Permit scheme,
yes,
but extending
please.
it to more nationalities without the cut-off date. A smaller thing, but removing the English language requirement for skilled worker for some types of short-term workers. Using the shortage occupation list to narrow the occupations which can get permission to come unsponsored for a short period of time, so have a sort of unsponsored route, perhaps based on the shortage occupation list. And finally, amending the service supplier route to make it sort of more generous in terms of the requirements, to make it open for a wider range of short-term workers. They were the sort of main options or possibilities for change, but I guess we wait to see what Ms. Braverman brings us. Excellent. Well, thanks very much to all the speakers. That was really, really interesting. We do have time now for questions, and I think there are a few on the Slido. Yeah, so I don't know if we just start at the top, and I don't know maybe if whoever wants to jump in, but the first one is it's got a vote. Can a company in the UK which has a contract with a company overseas employ staff under the PA7 permitted route for kitchen manufacture? Any thoughts on this?
Well, I can jump in. I haven't looked at it now for I think a couple of weeks, but this looks very close to what I was looking at for these artisan stonemasons I was talking to you about, and saying that it is just in the guidance and in the rule itself, it does not seem to cover these more broad kind of short-term contracts, and I can't get definitive response from policy. That's my current experience of trying to use PA7 for something similar, not kitchen manufacture and installation, but installation of another artisan trade similar.
Okay.
I think my issue would be as well the query, the fact that, I mean, maybe it's the way the question's phrased, but the UK entity can't employ themselves in terms of, I mean, normally what we'd see is the entity in UK, entity overseas, sending their workers who are employed overseas into the UK as well.
Sorry, yeah, I was interpreting it that way. Yeah, you're right. Yeah.
Okay. Next one, what are the key things that should be included in a letter of support for a non-visa national business visitor?
Okay, I'll take that one as well.
Actually, you're on mute, sister. Go for it, Megan. Sorry.
Okay. I think the key things to be included are particularly who's paying for the trip. Ideally, you've got letters from the entity in the UK and their employer overseas confirming how the trip's being funded, how long they're going to be here, evidence. Again, typically in the form of the employer overseas saying this is where I drill down with the client to find out exactly what they're doing, and this is where I interpret the rules and explain to the immigration officer that's going to have the 30 seconds, possibly at the end of their shift, have to deal with this, exactly where in the rules to look to see how these people. I tried to sew it very nicely into an immigration rule so that the immigration officer has a very easy decision to make.
Agreed. And, at the beginning, just say, this isn't work. I mean, provided you have the instructions to have the license to say that so categorically, but, just front it right at the top.
Yeah, and if I have had conversations that, and I do typically also ask to speak to the individual, to speak to the company in the UK, where I say to them, these are the parameters, and I'll put that in my letter too, to say I have advised them on the parameters of the business visitor rules and PA, whichever, and this is what they're doing. If I can be that strong.
Great, thank you. The next question. Is payment of income tax or contributing to social security in the UK a consideration for identifying whether a set of facts constitutes work or business? Any thoughts on that?
I mean, I would say it's a good indicator of work. I think if you're paying income tax, that's a bit of a red flag that you are earning an income. I mean, for the purposes of, if I'll talk about my frontier worker permit scheme again, they do ask for things like that as evidence to show evidence of work or evidence of self-employment for the purposes of an application such as that. And I know within the business visit visa rules, there's very strict occasions you can earn any form of remuneration as a business visitor. So I think it's a consideration. I don't know, anybody else got any thoughts?
Yeah, it's same as consideration. I think, like you said, for the purpose of a frontier work permit application, that's exactly what you want to provide.
Yeah.
If
but don't
you
need
got
to.
that with a don't need to.
Yeah, it's not mandatory.
No, but if you've got it, that's
Yeah.
going to genuine and effective work very, very definitively. But if you have a business visitor in that situation, unless it's operating through a payroll company that's based in the UK, well, even then, they wouldn't be necessarily paying UK income tax. So I think it's a big problem for a business visitor.
I agree.
And I guess that they're doing so much of this information sharing now that it's ever more likely to catch up on you. Next question is, can a frontier worker transfer to a skilled worker if there is sponsorship in place?
Well,
yes.
Sorry. Yes is the answer,
yes.
definitely. But would you want to? That's the whole beauty of the frontier worker permit. I mean, if it works, why would you go near sponsorship? I mean, I'm just saying that kind of rhetorically, but I mean, of course, there are the means, and definitely while you're biding time to get the sponsorship in place and all the other sort of trappings of the sponsorship model, frontier worker permit can be used. But if it's in place, it just avoids all that onerous cost and monitoring that's part of the skilled worker piece. I don't know, Joe or Megan.
I think it's just settlement, isn't it? At the end of the day, that's the key point. If somebody's plans change and they like it over here and they want to create a future and work towards permanent residency and citizenship, that would be the only reason I could see. But yes, it is possible. Not done it as yet, but it is possible.
Great. And then for next one, for non-visa nationals, when there is concern in relation to permitted activities, is an online application advisable to receive definitive decision in advance of travel?
We were talking about this, weren't we?
Yeah, I was gonna kind of say it's dependent on the appetite for risk for the individual, for the company, because of course you can do that, and then it's a much safer trip. But the question is, you have that problem that if it's questionable, question first whether you should be going down this route or if you have another alternative option, because at the end of the day, a refusal at the airport and a refusal of visa application are going to impact that person going forward in any subsequent future application they may make. But yeah, I guess it's that question of it's rather unpleasant to get refused at the airport,
Well, the
particularly,
certainty.
it's the certainty. It's, if you're coming from Australia to be refused versus coming
Yeah.
from France to be refused, that, there's different considerations outside of immigration rules, just of,
I had
simple pain.
I'd been into liaising with the Home Office about a particular project where we were trying to rely on PA7, and in the past they'd been quite helpful in offering an opinion that yes, it did came within it. The last time I attempted that, they came back with a firm, we won't give a view, you must go and make a visa application to get that final judgment. So I think that is the Home Office's position. If you want absolute certainty, you're left with having to make the visa application. But as Megan says, it does expose that particular applicant to a lot of risk.
Okay. Brilliant. Well, I think unfortunately we're kind of at the end of the time now. In relation to the final questions, so apologies that they're not answered. But I just remains to say thanks very much indeed for to our super speakers. That was really, really interesting, and I think we covered a lot of bases. And yeah, hopefully we'll see some movement on this in due course. But thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.